Hello friends and welcome to a new video. Skyward Sword HD is out and it's looking better than ever. No longer need to worry about the Wii Remote stupid battery running out, or that you might smash it to the wall and rage quit due to the awkward motion controls. We travel to many familiar regions of primordial Hyrule and end up in the holiest springs that ever existed. But ever since I watched a playthrough of Skyward Sword,
cause back then I didn't have the means to play it,
I have been wondering, where is the third spring? We have Skyview Spring, representing Farore, and Earth Spring, representing Din. But the Spring of Nehru seems to be absent for some reason. Enter Breath of the Wild. It only does not have the Spring of Courage for Farore, but Power for Din and Wisdom for Nehru as well. And from the architecture and geometry of the ancient springs in Breath of the Wild, we can for sure say that these are the same springs that Link and Zelda traveled to during the Sky era. Skyview Spring being the Spring of Courage, and Earth Spring being the Spring of Power. Their locations also match, with Spring of Courage being in Faron, and while Spring of Power is in Akala, it is still right next to Death Mountain, most likely moved with land masses across the ages. So then surely the Spring of Wisdom must have existed during the events of Skyward Sword as well. But why isn't it present in an accessible location then? That is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. This also contains spoilers for Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, so you have been warned. So let's first go through the purpose of the springs, so that we understand what kind of part the Spring of Wisdom would have had. In Skyward Sword, the purpose of the springs is to purify the Spirit Maiden Zelda, the goddess Hylia reborn as a mortal, and for her to regain her memory of her time as Hylia. But they also worked as trials for Hylia's chosen hero, Link, for him to prove himself as the legendary hero, and to fulfill his destiny of destroying Demise and bringing the people of Hylia back to the surface. In Breath of the Wild and Age of Calamity, these springs have a similar purpose. When Zelda has trouble awakening her sealing powers, she is sent to pray to all the three springs in hopes for her power to awaken. But unlike her predecessor from ancient times, her efforts were futile. As for the hero Link, these once again work as trials for him to prove himself. But this time, he has to offer a scale of each of the three dragons that soar through the skies of Hyrule, which may or may not be descended from the ancient dragons we meet in Skyward Sword. So now that we know what the purpose of the springs is, we can start to discuss why the Spring of Wisdom is absent in Skyward Sword. In Breath of the Wild, we learn that anyone who is under 17 years old is not allowed to enter the spring. So could it be possible that the same rule applied even back then? You might think that how that is possible, since there are no human beings on the surface at that point. But in case you have forgotten, there was a proper civilization at the surface, who were then sent to the sky when Demise attacked. And maybe these springs were a great pilgrimage destination, and that the rule that no people under 17 are allowed to enter the Spring of Wisdom might have been decided by Hylia herself. The age of Link and Zelda is never determined, but from their appearance, they seem to be in their mid-teens, so maybe 16 years old? Or maybe they already are 17. But after the Earth Spring, Zelda and Imp realized that due to Girahim being really close to their tails, that they don't have enough time to go there in the current time period, but then visited it after they went through the Gates of Time. But we will return to that later. But why is the Spring of Wisdom only 17 plus? Because they offer complimentary shots that are not given to people who are under 17 years old? Maybe, but it could be that each of these springs are named after these three virtues, not only because of the goddesses, but also because people would go there to pray to get more of that specific virtue. An example from our world could be the Japanese Kiyomizu-dera, or Pure Water Temple. which is located in Kyoto, and there is a waterfall called Ottawa Waterfall, which is divided into 3 separate streams where one can drink from. And it is believed that these streams can grant the drinker either longer life, love, or success at studies, but some people interpret it as wisdom. But you are only allowed to drink from one of them, which is not the case with the sacred springs. Well, maybe in the ancient times, but who knows? But that is a whole another rabbit hole on what kind of civilization the people of Hylia had, so I'm trying not to get too sidetracked, so I'll try to keep it brief. As it is said in our world, that knowledge cannot be truly understood without experience. And in most cases, you get the experience as the years pass, so basically when one becomes an adult. When one actually is an adult is up to debate, so let's not get into that deeply. But it could be similar to how we think about wisdom teeth. As it is said that when they come out you are much older and wiser compared to when all the other deciduous teeth came out. And when do wisdom teeth emerge? Well, according to Google, they usually emerge between ages 17 and 25. So there you have it. But in the world of Hylia, the age of 17 could be when one comes of age, and then they are allowed to climb up to the Spring of Wisdom and pray for knowledge from the goddesses. Of course, one would also need to be old enough to fully appreciate power and courage, but it is wisdom that gives you the proper knowledge to utilize these virtues. And it is pretty much confirmed in Age of Calamity when it is said that those who lack the spring's namesake are not allowed to set foot in it. But how would people know to pray these 3 virtues from these 3 springs when they have completely different names? Well, it might be that even though they had different names, they were still dedicated to the goddesses, and the goddesses were already associated with the 3 virtues. And the names of Skyview, Earth, and the unnamed Spring of Wisdom might have been given to make them feel more connected to the goddesses and nature, as Sky and Earth are often associated with divinities in ancient mythologies in our world. For example, Uranus and Gaia in ancient Greece, and Nut and Geb in ancient Egypt. So what could have been the name of the ancient Spring of Wisdom? Well, if we follow the pattern of mythologies, water is usually the 3rd element after Sky and Earth. For example, Poseidon. And since Naver is already associated with water, it only makes sense. So it could have been Aqua Spring or Icy Spring because of the freezing climates of Mount Lanevu or something like that. And it was only some time before Breath of the Wild the names were changed to Power, Wisdom and Courage. Why they were remained is unknown, but maybe they wanted to rename them something that is more related to the virtue of the springs. Or maybe the old names of Skyview and Earth were lost in time, but the springs were still known to be connected to the goddesses, so they were renamed as such. But now if we backtrack a little, so if Zelda did visit the Spring of Wisdom, when did she do it? And why didn't Link also go there? Like I mentioned before, it could be possible that Zelda and Impa were supposed to travel to the Mountain of Spring of Wisdom, but since Girahim was so close behind them, they decided not to risk it and go to the spring after they have gone to the past, where they were out of Girahim's reach. But how do I know that she didn't go there before? Like before the Earth Spring or after it? Well, the answer is really simple. There just isn't any time. It is seen that Zelda is always a little bit ahead of Link, but he's also right behind her, so there just isn't enough time for Zelda to go to a completely different region without Link realizing it. Another reason is that the Spring of Wisdom is most likely the last spring to visit. Like I mentioned before, wisdom is needed to utilize the virtues of power and courage, so it would have most likely given Zelda the final pieces of Hylia's memory and the knowledge of what she has to do to destroy Demise. This is supported by how Zelda's attitude has changed between meeting her in Temple of Time and Temple of Hylia. And in Breath of the Wild, the Spring of Wisdom is the last spring Link and Zelda visit.
Which is probably cause Zelda isn't 17 yet, but I'd like to think that it is not only because of that.
And they seem to be visiting the springs in the same order as in Skyward Sword. How do I know that the Spring of Wisdom does exist in Skyward Sword, you ask? Well, that is a very good question, my dear friend. When you start looking more carefully, you may notice that Mount Lanayru is actually present in Skyward Sword. Well, almost. It is there, but obviously not an accessible location. Similarly to how it has been theorized that Snow Peak already existed in Ocarina of Time past Sura's Fountain, but just wasn't an accessible location. To the east of Faron Woods, you can see that there is a surprisingly tall mountain, taller than any other. And I think that that mountain is the mountain that becomes Mount Lanayru. To add to that, in Breath of the Wild, Mount Lanayru is located northeast of Faron Woods, so the location fits perfectly. And if we look at the map of Skyward Sword, it is somewhere around here. Of course, it is not the exact same location, but there has been tens of thousands of years between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, so over time the landmasses have moved the mountain and/or the forest. Similarly how in Skyward Sword the mountain doesn't seem to be icy or snowy, quite the contrary, since it actually seems to have some forestation at its foot, but it may have just happened over time. So could that actually be the lost location of the ancient Spring of Wisdom? Or am I just looking way too into this? So now that we have gone through the reasons why Spring of Wisdom isn't in Skyward Sword lore-wise, but what about gameplay-wise? Since I think it is pretty unlikely that the creators of Skyward Sword didn't even think about adding it. Especially when many things in Zelda come in threes. The 3 goddesses, 3 spiritual stones, 3 keys, 3 pendants, 3 goddess pearls, the list goes on and on. And well, of course, not all things in Zelda come in threes. For example, there are 4 elements and 4 fused shadows and so on and so on. But since that game features a primordial state of Hyrule, and has a lot to do with the 3 goddesses, and when the 3 areas we travel to are dedicated to them because of the 3 sacred flames, and they are literally there in the names, it would have made sense for them to add the 3rd spring for the 3rd goddess. So why didn't they? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that they didn't want to make the game too repetitive. If they would have made a 4th region with an icy mountain and then doing the quest of looking for Zelda and only finding a puddle at the end, would in the long run seem a bit tiresome. And since Skyward Sword is a bit slow-paced game, which is not a bad thing, it might get a bit boring eventually. Another reason is that it might have been too inconsistent. Since at the end of the game you have to visit all the previous areas again for various reasons, and if there were too many of them, it might have just been too confusing or time consuming, since you'd have to keep going in and out and in and out and in and out without an end. And like I mentioned earlier, the 3 regions are dedicated to the 3 goddesses, so who would have the 4th region be dedicated to? Would Tetraforce would have been made true? Would it have been Hylia's area? Well, neither. Probably. Hylia doesn't have an area of her own, but that is most likely since she governs the whole land, so technically everything is hers. And Tetraforce, well, let's just not get into that rabbit hole this time. What could have done is that the snowy area is Nayru's area, and Lanayru is Hylia's area, or just some desolated area that belongs to no one. But that poses a problem, since the 3 areas are clearly in a Triforce shape, Eldin being Power and Din, Faron being Courage and Furore, and Lanayru being Wisdom and Nayru. So some random snow area on the right side would have been just really random and wouldn't have just made any sense at all. And even if they would have replaced Lanayru Desert with Mount Lanayru in the left corner, that would have posed a huge continuity problem, since in almost all the previous games that location has contained Gerudo Desert, which has been confirmed to have been Lanayru Desert. So having an ice mountain there would have not made any sense. So, since Lanayru Desert is Nehru's area, why isn't the Spring of Wisdom there? They could have really easily put it in the Temple of Time, so why not? The answer is, once again, really simple. Because it is a flipping desert. A desert where a freaking gigantic ocean has dried up and turned into a part of the desert. So if a whole ocean has turned into a desert, how could a small spring survive? No matter how holy it is or sacred it is, it just seems impossible. And yes, there are the time shift stones that could have temporarily restored the spring, but the fact that it had dried in the first place would have kinda removed all the sacredness from it. Especially since the desertification might have been caused by something else than the forces of nature. But that remains a theory for another day. So, it has been quite a while since I last uploaded, and I'm really sorry about it. I got really caught up with life and, well, the rest is history. But while I've been gone, I have gained 400 subscribers, and I can't express how happy that actually makes me feel. It might not feel much for someone, but I never thought that anyone would actually see my videos. So the fact that they made 400 people subscribe to me is just so amazing. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. But with that all said, I really hope you enjoyed this video. It has been a while since I did a theory video, so hopefully this made at least some sense. So was it good or just complete gibberish? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to know when I upload next. Thank you so very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a lots of love. Bye bye!